keep getting these weird ads on Twitter. Like it's all masculinity influencers pumping iron and some dating site that lets you find sugar daddies. What is going on? Am I the only one?
They figured you out, Michelle.
Let's be clear. I have been married for, since God was a boy. I have not done anything to deserve sugar daddy dating ads. And I'm not sure that I'm prepared for the Threads version of this. I'm just not. From New York Times Opinion, I'm Michelle Cottle.
I'm Carlos Lozada.
I'm Lydia Polgreen, and this is Matter of Opinion. So, Ross is out this week on a well-deserved vacation, but we're going to talk about the trials and tribulations of social media. In particular, there's been a lot going on with Twitter, which is a social network that is beloved by journalists and politicians, but less so by other people. And now there's a big new competitor to Twitter, and it is called Threads. It was created by the company Meta, which is the biggest social media company in the world, famous for platforms like Facebook and Instagram, as well as the messaging platform WhatsApp. And this app, Threads, seems to be giving Twitter a real run for its money. So I thought this was a great chance to talk about what's happening. How is social media changing? And what do we want from it today? So, first of all, are you guys on Threads?
Be honest, Carlos.
Well, I will be, but this will just kind of emphasize the conflict I feel. So I've been active on Twitter for a long time. And when I saw everyone posting, they're like, I've joined Threads on Twitter, I decided that I should do the same. But here's what happened. I didn't know you had to have an Instagram account to join Threads.
Ooh.
And I've not been active on Instagram. And so I had to figure Instagram out first. And then I had to join Threads, and all of a sudden I'm checking Threads, I'm checking Twitter, I'm figuring out Instagram, and I just stopped and I said, what am I doing with my life? Like, why am I spending time this way? So actually I figured out, which is no mean feat, how to delete my new Instagram, how to delete Threads.
Ooh.
I am not making a big statement about like how I'm leaving social media forever, but we've gone down this path, right? Before with Twitter. I don't know why, 100 million plus or whatever the number is now that people who have joined Threads somehow feel that it's going to be different and better this time. And maybe instead of jumping onto a new network, we can use the decline of Twitter as a chance to just reconsider whether, this is how we want to live our lives.
Oh my God, you want people to be reflective and thoughtful, Carlos. That is so adorable. I love it. I love it.
Cute.
I've been grudgingly passive on Twitter. I tend to join things for work purposes, to follow politicians, to follow other journalists, and to comment as little as humanly possible, because it is my position that Twitter America is the worst America, except with the possibility of Facebook America. So I'm like, good riddance.
Well, I mean, look, I understand why both of you feel that way. However, I have been a Twitter evangelist for a very long time. I remember when I got my first Twitter account, I was a young foreign correspondent working in West Africa. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. And I think a lot of people look at what has happened with social media and they're like, cesspool, garbage fire, dumpster fire. This is all really, really terrible. And I think it's salutary to think back to what the world was like before social media, when people couldn't really talk to each other across big distances and you couldn't have these kinds of globe spanning conversations. And for me as a young foreign correspondent, the promise of it was, hey, this is an opportunity that rather than having a one way, I'm going to publish stories in the New York Times about what's going on in Senegal or what's going on in Congo or Nigeria. And, those people can maybe write a letter to an editor or an email to me. But now we have this opportunity to have a public conversation about it. And that to me felt so exciting and so intoxicating. And, of course, then comes the Arab Spring and, this idea that social media can really sort of be a force for social change. And everybody was so excited and optimistic. And I was certainly excited and optimistic. And then it got really bad and really ugly because I think everyone realized that this is not a neutral phenomenon, right? Like these tools of organization and of change can be used by really anyone who wants to make change happen. And when it was, people advocating for democracy against the autocratic rulers of the Middle East, that was one thing. But when it's suddenly, neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, Virginia, it starts to look very, very different. And so I've sort of been on this kind of like full journey with social media, and I just can't quite quit it, that like spark of optimism. So I am on Threads. I am also on Blue Sky, which is another, app that was created.
Oh, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
I'd always just seen it when people like written it, and I thought it was like Blueski, like Brewski. It's like, no one had ever said it out loud to me before. Blue Sky makes a lot more sense. Okay.
Yeah. And so like the sort of individual post, the like slangy name for it is a skeet. Which I think is pretty funny.
Okay. Well, then Blueski makes more sense.
Brewski's on Blueski.
We're having a ski.
Yeah. But so I really get this thirst that people have to connect in this particular way.
I can totally see how you get this sense of community, or you find people who share your, particular niche, hobby or attraction to something. But on balance, what we're winding up with is people want attention. And the way you get attention on Twitter is you become the biggest jerk in the room. And that is kind of what Twitter now feeds. And especially since Musk has taken over, there's not even a pretense that you're trying to like keep it from being overrun by, say neo-Nazis or whatever. I mean, it's just one of those things. Eventually these lovely, bring us together democratic tools become hostage to disinformation and folks running amok along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing that made Twitter really special, and I guess I shouldn't talk about it in the past tense, it still exists, and who knows, Elon Musk, the amazing and erratic entrepreneur, could yet turn things around. But the thing that's really different about Twitter from all of the other social networks, all of which are actually much bigger than Twitter, right, is that on Facebook, you post something and then underneath that post, there are comments. On Instagram, you post something and underneath that post, there are comments. But Twitter actually elevates the reply to something that you post to the same status as your post. So it's actually conversational rather than, here's an artifact and then a bunch of people's unrelated comments about it. It's much more kind of a dialogue. And I think like that's what really sort of lies at the heart of the appeal. And I think that there is this human desire for dialogue, like this way in which we all want to reach out and talk to each other. And I think that in some ways sort of explains why Threads, this new app from Meta, has taken off. I think that we all want to be able to have these kinds of conversations. We might not want to have them in exactly the way that they were happening on Twitter, but I think that desire to connect and that desire to exchange ideas and to talk is a very, very human desire. It's just that throughout history, it has been limited technologically to the people who are close to us or to kind of one-to-one communication rather than one-to-many.
I think we talk a lot about the desire to connect, and I think that's real, but it's also a desire for validation and approval and recognition. I mean, journalists and politicians are sort of like exquisitely conditioned to respond to signals of external approval. For journalists, it's like people reading our stories. Hey, listening to our podcast. How many downloads, right? For politicians, it's getting votes. It's raising money. It's seeing a lot of crowds at your rally. So to have a network, right, that you can access on your phone or your laptop or whatever, that instantly quantifies how much people like you, like the one thing you said, how many people follow you. It's perfectly made for those kinds of people. Think of those terms, likes, follows. They're very political in a sense, and so I think, yes, the connection part has been real for me, and that's great. And, and I have genuinely made those connections, but also it's about that like instant gratification of feeling that like that thing I said was smart or clever. So yes, it's community, but also it's something more narcissistic than that, I think.
It is interesting, though, to think a little bit about the differences between these platforms. Like I talked about Twitter as being a place where you post and reply and them having, sort of equal weight. The fastest growing social media platforms, I think, are much less interactive in that sense and much more algorithmic. I mean, one of the things that made Twitter really different, in addition to the sort of replies having the same kind of status as the original post, is that you could force the app to show you a feed that is just of your choosing, right? So I could follow the people that I'm interested in, and the only things that I would see in my feed are those things, and some advertisements, but there are fewer and fewer advertisements on Twitter these days. And so a key difference between Threads and Twitter is that Threads moves completely in the direction of algorithmic curation. And I seem to be the only one who's like really actively playing around on it. But it's super interesting because it's built on the back of Instagram. It's all of the people that I follow on Instagram, which tend to be like much less about politics and much more art and entertainment. And I follow a lot of like food and restaurant things. And so the feed that I'm getting fed on Threads looks very, very different from my Instagram feed, right? Like,
sorry, it's different from Instagram or different from Twitter?
I'm sorry, it's different from Twitter,
okay.
Right? Because Twitter is like, these are the accounts that I follow and that I really am interested in.
Right. But I don't know that, like, should we trust Zuckerberg more than we trust Musk? You know, like
no!
what? Like, I just love how everyone is like
not.
rushing into the arms, you know, like, oh, like Elon Musk is terrible. Let's put our faith in Mark Zuckerberg. You know, like, Elon Musk is doing for Zuckerberg what Trump did for George W. Bush, you know, like make him look really good in hindsight. You know, like, hey, maybe that's better. Maybe that was really great after all. Remember how much we loved Facebook, right? When we didn't.
Oh my God, we're trading in one tech man-child for another again. And Zuckerberg is no better. I mean, granted, he has not challenged Musk for a literal penis measuring contest, which is,
hey, we're a family podcast. We're a family podcast.
It was bad enough when they were doing we're going to cage match. But now Musk is like literally ready to measure his tackle against Zuckerberg. And only that kind of nonsense could make Zuckerberg look like a sympathetic figure. But
Logan Roy did say that sometimes that is the competition.
Okay, friends, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk about the future of social media and whether there's any hope that it's going to be any better than the past. And we're back. So we've talked about the saga of Twitter, and now I want to turn to the broader social media landscape. Is social media really social anymore? That was that term was created, but I mean, you think about something like TikTok, right? And what's interesting is I'm not a big TikTok user. The way that I'm primarily use TikTok is that people in my group chats, which I would say is actually now my primary social network or group chats, get sent to me and I watch them and think they're funny, and then I send them on to other people on other group chats. So I don't know, is social media even the right term?
I mean, I love the TikTok videos of the guys in Appalachia doing their comedy routines. My friends and I do the same thing with the group chats. They send me videos of like people doing little mini skits, and I love those. Those are fun, but it's not like me chatting with the guy in Appalachia who's doing it.
Social media is very benign as a concept. It sounds like, why would you be against it? It's social, it's people getting together. And I don't know what else to call it. It's the term has the first mover advantage, but it seems excessively kind to what the worst examples of it have become. And it seems excessively vague for the variety that exists, just what you all have just described.
Yeah, I don't necessarily find social media to be especially social these days. And in some ways, like the socialness of it is largely unwanted. So it's maybe we could all start socializing in ever smaller groups. But is there a path to a better version of social media?
I mean, these things are always on balance, right? Like, I did love the idea of Twitter as being a news source for things happening in far-flung places where people didn't have a lot of access, to regular mainstream media sources. But it's always going to be one of these things that needs a little bit of oversight or a little bit of curation. And the American government in particular does not seem to have any kind of sense of this. The market's not going to handle it. I mean, you have the Facebook algorithms, which aren't just promoting, connection. They're pushing up the most extreme, most violence-inducing, nastiest stuff possible. So with things like that going on, I don't have a lot of hope that we are able to get our arms around this. So we just are just letting it run wild.
Well, I mean, we are, but we aren't, right? I mean, I think that we're seeing a bunch of attempts to regulate this space. And it used to be that there was like a lot of activity in terms of antitrust or, attempts to do regulations around privacy and then attempts to do regulations around disinformation and misinformation. But I think there's been a really interesting move that you're seeing more on kind of the conservative side of American politics to restrict access to social media for young people around, mental health and other issues like that. So I think there's actually been from a bunch of different places, a lot of ferment and activity to try and pivot social media into a different direction or to restrict access to it altogether.
Although with something like that, I tend to think that as a society, something that we know we can't possibly regulate or get our arms around in toto, we tend to focus on kids. So we're not going to let kids do this. We're not going to let kids do that. For me, that's just kind of a signal that we've given up for the broader purposes.
Regulation is also kind of antithetical to the original ethos of what this was supposed to be. Do you remember that really super melodramatic declaration of the independence of cyberspace that came out from the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the 90s? I looked it up, and here's how it began. It was like, governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You're not welcome among us. I mean, and it said that cyberspace was developing its own social contract. It would be governed solely by, get this, the golden rule. So the government could just back off on regulation. We always dream that new technologies will kind of save us. And then we dream that they will destroy us, right? When they kind of do a little of both.
And you can complain about gatekeepers infinitely, but I do think that there is a real issue as we deal in a new generation of AI and disinformation, when there are no gatekeepers in terms of who's out in the public square, rallying folks around this stuff. And we just saw this court case where the Biden administration has been ordered not to contact social media companies about stuff. And that is a hurdle to getting them to deal with disinformation. So, like COVID disinformation, things like this, and you can always take it too far. But what you're looking at is increasing means of communicating stuff that's just absolutely not true, destructive, violence promoting, let's all go storm the Capitol, at the same time as you're just kind of throwing up your hands and being like, oh, well, we'll just have to let that go. That's nothing to be done about it.
Well, technology has always changed the way that we communicated. I think about the role of Radio Mille Collines in the Rwandan genocide as a place where, they drummed up support and got people to go out and murder their neighbors. That's the same thing that happened on Facebook in places like Myanmar. So in some ways, this is an old story and a new story. But we are going into a really interesting time where social media, I think, is going to be a huge factor, meaning the 2024 presidential election, right? So
interesting is one word for it.
Yes, interesting. Maybe terrifying is a better word. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I'm curious what you guys think about this, is, what does it mean for our politics and for 2024 that we're going to be looking at, presumably, a much more fragmented social media landscape, particularly around journalism and politics?
I think it's great. I am all on board with the fragmentation of that sort of illusion of the public square that Twitter gave us. it was just like talking to ourselves, yet while thinking you were talking to everyone. Nothing I hated more than when someone on Twitter would say like, hey, read the room, like, well, we're in different rooms, we're not even in the same house sometimes. So like, shut up, I don't think that was healthy. I think some fragmentation of that is healthy.
Although I will take the more contrarian view, which is that the fragmentation of the media landscape and letting people sit inside their echo chambers has been a problem up until this point, and I don't foresee it getting much better. And it also, again, and I know this is like my obsession, but we have not figured out at all how to deal with misinformation. It's almost impossible to tell the fakes apart anymore. You can put Ron DeSantis' head on whoever you want. You can make people say whatever you want. And if you're policing one or two major sites, that's one thing, but you're going to be policing, dozens of these sites. And I think what it's going to have to happen is you're going to have to go downstream and start teaching people how to deal with misinformation before they're ever on these sites.
I trust fragmentation more than I trust monopolization, though.
That's what I was going to just say is like, to me, what you're describing actually sounds a lot more of what the kind of like, paranoid conspiratorial landscape looked like pre-social media, right? You had radio programs, right? You had, there were all of these conspiracy theory, newsletters, like literally letters that would arrive in your mail. But they were all kind of, I think, segmented against one another, right? You'd have, kind of the right-wing conspiracy theories and the left-wing conspiracy theorists, and they all had their own quote-unquote platforms, whether it was a radio show or some people would record things and send them out on tapes. And there's a huge and very varied history in the United States of the ways in which conspiratorial disinformation material, moves around. And I think that like, rather than having a central clearinghouse for it where, anyone can come and go and get it, having it fragmented on lots of different platforms feels, to me, a lot more manageable and a way that those types of theories have a harder time getting into kind of like the bloodstream of the body politic because they're sort of stuck in these cul-de-sacs.
I don't know. Twitter was not the primary source of the folks who decided they wanted to trash the Capitol, right?
Well, no, but I think what's interesting as well, and this is a thing that's come up in a lot of the conversations that, Meta executives have had about Threads. And of course, they are just so thrilled with themselves at having launched the fastest growing social media app ever in the world. I think Threads is now up to about 100 million users. But I listened to Adam Mosseri, who's the head of Instagram, be interviewed by our colleagues on Hard Fork, the New York Times technology podcast. And they're saying very explicitly that, we do not see this as a platform for news and for journalism and politics. And Meta as a whole, I think, has been moving very hard in a direction away from news and politics because who wants the hassle? It's brought a lot of unwanted scrutiny. So they're really leaning in. And the reason that this is built off of Instagram, I think, is because they're leaning into, entertainment and, sports and influencers and beauty and those kinds of things. And yes, journalists will be there and yes, politicians will be there just like they are on Instagram and Facebook now. But I think as a company, Meta is running as fast and as far as it can away from news and politics.
Maybe, although with the presidential race coming up, Zuckerberg does not have a great track record on putting anything above his money grubbing. So I will, remain vaguely hopeful, but I'm not going to count on it.
There was a book like 5 years ago called Anti-Social Media by a professor at UVA. And he basically was arguing that if he wanted to build an efficient machine for spreading propaganda and lies and mistrust and enabling widespread surveillance, like you'd be hard pressed to do better than creating Facebook, and sort of the modern social media networks. I think we're stuck with it, though. Like they fail, but then a new one comes along, right? Like, remember Friendster, right? One of my favorite moments was in 2009. There was a book that came out called Stealing MySpace. The battle to control the most popular website in America was the subtitle. And it was published just as the site was cratering and Twitter and Facebook were becoming dominant. So, it's hard. Like I started off saying that I logged on to Threads and then I immediately deleted my account because I got all these qualms. But it's hard to imagine our giving up entirely on these sort of digital instant gratification machines that reward us for pomposity and popularity.
there's no way it's going away. I mean, once you've introduced something like this, it's going to spiral. And the best that you can hope for is that each iteration learns something from the previous one. I see no sign that we're doing that right now, but that's the best you can hope for.
Well, on that bleak note, Michelle, thanks. All I know is I'm really, really happy to have this little social network here to talk about these questions. So, all right, well, let's leave it there. When we come back, hot and cold. Okay, folks, and finally, it is time for Hot Cold, where every week one of us shares something that we're into, over, or somewhere in between. So, who's got the hot cold this week?
I am hot colding today.
Yay!
It's not something I am entirely cold on, or perhaps something I should be cold on, but I'm not.
Are you tepid?
So I guess
You're tepid.
So I have to tell you a story first, and that is that I spent the bulk of the 1980s in Peru, where I'm from, and at a distance, I imbibed a sort of a weird, erratic mix of American culture, right? Like Knight Rider and the A-Team were huge for the middle school set, dubbed into Spanish, of course. Knight Rider was El Auto Fantástico. But one piece of American cultural hegemony that did not make it to me was The Cosby Show. Later, I got married. My wife, who's American and grew up here, told me how much she had loved the show when she was young. And we have 3 kids now. We consume a lot of culture together. We read books out loud at breakfast. We watch Nature and Nova and, C-SPAN. Sorry.
Yeah, it's like that in my house, too.
But recently, all this to say, we recently started watching The Cosby Show.
Ooh, controversial.
Bold.
Our 3 kids are now about the ages that, Denise and Theo and Vanessa were when the show began. And we discussed this with the kids ahead of time, explaining, who Bill Cosby was as an artist and as a person and the accusations against him. We talk about the dilemmas of appreciating art by people who do terrible things, but I think we're all enjoying parts of it. My kids, especially the older 2, are struck by the kind of casual cruelty sometimes in the way the Cliff Huxtable character, Cosby's character, treats the kids. That reminds me of the kind of undercurrents I found in his books as well. I won't say I'm hot on Bill Cosby. I'm not sitting here trying to redeem him.
Oh, Carlos, you're going to take a beat down for that.
But I am open to watching and thinking about this show and having that experience as a family. And that is my hot cold.
I think that's very interesting in terms of retaking back some culture that has been ruined by the kind of personal grossness of the person involved. I mean, you run across this all the time. Do you watch Roman Polanski movies? Do you watch Woody Allen movies? I think the artist versus the art is kind of an enduring dilemma for us. And I'm fascinated by how you're handling this with your kids, no less.
It's a selective dilemma, by the way. Do you all listen to Michael Jackson's music? Of course you do, because Michael Jackson is so good, he is uncancelable.
Well, and it's also where do you stop, right? I mean, I'm a huge fan of Janet Jackson, and I saw her in concert a couple of years ago, and she had this whole montage about how amazing her brother Michael was. And I was like, I don't think he's so wonderful. But at the same time, I'm not going to stop loving Janet Jackson because she loves her brother. Where does it end? How do you draw the line? I just will also say that, I loved The Cosby Show when I was a kid. I also grew up outside of the United States. And for me, it was a really crucial touchstone to trying to understand not just American culture, but also what it is to be Black in America. And I was a little surprised when I realized when I got here as a teenager that it actually wasn't really like that for most Black people. But putting that aside,
disappointment.
I also The show that I really, really, really loved, because it hit me at exactly the right moment, was A Different World, which was the sequel that was all about, when Lisa Bonet went on to, an HBCU
Hillman.
and Dwayne, Hillman.
What a great show. That was an awesome show.
Again, I thought that's what college was going to be like, and turns out that I was wrong. So
life is full of
life is not like NBC. Yeah.
Oh, well, I would rewatch anything with you guys. Thanks so much for a great conversation.
Thank you, Liddy.
Thank you.
See you next week. If you liked today's episode, be sure to follow Matter of Opinion on your favorite podcast app. And if you loved it, leave us a review wherever you're listening. Matter of Opinion is produced by Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Phoebe Lett, and Derek Arthur. It is edited by Stephanie Joyce. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Carol Saburo, Sonia Herrero, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samilewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.